Hey guys, Jarretman here for GTO Wizard. Today we're going to look at how to use the trainer effectively to study a spot. So let's say you've been looking at BVB 3-bet pots and you've studied some preflop ranges, you've studied some flop sims, you've looked at some boards, and now you want to start using the trainer in order to practice. So I'm going to take a look at what I personally do and what I think is the most effective way to use the trainer in order to best remember the spot. So the first thing that I do, which might be a little bit different, is that I like to focus on one board at a time. So for example, I would start off maybe an ace high board, study that board until I feel comfortable, and then move on to something like a low connected board or a king high board and kind of mix it up, do one board of different types. For today's example, we're going to take a look at one board, and I'm going to show you how I set up the trainer, and then we're going to get into actually using the trainer to study. So what you can do is you can find your preflop rake if you come into Solutions Library 6 Max preflop only. They have all the different rake structures here. For today's video, we're going to use 200 NL. And for today's video, we're going to use the 2x opening size just because the small blind opens to 3. And then the big blind 3-bets to 9, which is the most common sizing, I think, at least for what I've seen. But you can go back to here, and if you choose 2.5, you'll see that the small blind opens to 3.5 and the big blind goes to 10.5. It's not going to matter so much, but you might as well choose the sizes you want. So yeah, we're going to go back to 2 times, raise to 3, click on big blind raise to 9. If you haven't, the first thing you should be doing for these spots is getting a good feel for the preflop ranges. So before you get into post-flop training, before you get into the trainer to practice, make sure you have a good understanding of the preflop spots for both players. For this video, we're going to assume that you've already looked at preflop. So now we're just going to click on Solve Post-Flop with AI. I have settings set up already here. Looks like it's all automatic right now, actually. So the way I like to do this is I'll keep it at 1 bet size for the flop and turn. We're going to be playing as in position player. And then for the river, I'm going to set it to have dynamic. We're not going to specify the sizes to compare because I'm going to get GTO Wizard to do it for us, essentially. So we're going to give it the max number of bets, max number of raises, always add all in, and number of donks too. The flop and turn we can just leave on automatic. That means that it'll give us 1 raise size and 1 bet size. That's fine for what we're doing. And then we're going to go ahead and create solution. For today, we'll just take a look at this board, an ace high, double Broadway kind of connected board. This is the way that I like to set it up personally. You click on check, and then I click practice the spot. You can also just go directly into the trainer and kind of choose your spot, but I find that this is the easiest and quickest way to get into the exact spot that you want to get into. If you wanted to play as the out of position player, you wouldn't hit check, you would just hit practice this spot right away, and then you would play as the out of position player. These are all settings that you can change inside the trainer window here. You could go in and adjust exactly where you want to be, but this is the quickest I found. So if we hit start training, this will just give us, I already have one open here. This will just give us what we do. It'll just start us off right away in the sim with the default settings, but there are some settings that you can come into here and change. So if we go to all settings, one of the things that you can do is if you wanted to practice this spot with every board, you can come into here and just remove the flop. You can hit confirm, and now it'll give you a random flop every single time. If you want to practice just certain textures, what you can do is you can come into here and you can do, let's say you want to practice all of the ace high rainbow textures. Well, then you just set the suits to rainbow, you set it to not paired, and then you set it to, this doesn't really matter as much, but if you want to look at ace high rainbow textures that are disconnected, you could set it here. So for example, ace 7-2, ace 9-2. If you want to also leave that there's an open-ended straight draw possible, so this would include like ace 9-8, ace 8-7, and then you can come in down to here and you can just select the highest card. So it's going to be ace high, It's going to be disconnected. It's going to have an open-ended straight draw possible, not paired, and rainbow. You can hit confirm, and now you'll train every board that has these parameters. Another thing you can do is you can set this to any, and you can just do a subset of the flops. And what this does is it kind of captures all of the flops strategically. So there'll be every type of different flop condensed down to 85 flops instead of, 1,700. So that's another way that you can practice. But personally, what I like to do is I like to have one specific board at a time. I think that you get the most pattern recognition when you look at the strategies of one board. And when you continuously run hands over and over again on one board, you pick up the strategy a lot better, whereas it can be quite confusing, in my opinion, if you were to look at ace jack 7, what should we do with king 3 suited? And then next you're looking at, king jack or queen jack 7 or something like that, and all of a sudden the strategies get kind of mixed up. And obviously the spot will have patterns as a whole, but it's easier to identify them if you go one at a time, in my opinion, especially because you can look at turns and river strategies more easier. So other things you can do with the trainer is if you come down to hands and you come down to hand class, let's say that you want to take a look at how you should play your flush draws on this flop, or you want to take a look at how you should play whenever you have total air. So you have no made hand and no draw. You come into here, you set which hand class you want to play, you start training, and it'll only run you through spots that you have that hand class. This can be very useful if you find yourself kind of confused with what you should be doing with certain hand classes. And then the other thing that you can do is you can set it to close decisions. So what this does is it picks an EV threshold, I believe, and it picks it between two different decisions. So something that's really, really close in EV. This is really good if you've looked at the spot a lot and you feel very comfortable with the spot and you feel that you've been able to run through the trainer and get most of the things right. You can come into here and set it to close decisions and then try again. These ones are obviously going to be a bit more difficult in the trainer, but that's what they're there for. And then lastly, the actual settings. So you can run multiple tables. I don't see a lot of value in running multiple tables unless you want to simulate, playing an actual session. Maybe you struggle multi-tabling and you want to practice, so you could set multiple tables here. The game mode, I usually like to go full hand because you can see how it translates throughout the hand, with what you should be doing, how you follow through. But let's say that you just want to practice for your flop thresholds. Well, you can come into street and it'll only do the current street that you're on, one that you set it to. So if I set it to street here, you would just be testing your c-bet and defend your c-bet versus raise. And then of course you have the spot, which would just be testing your c-bet. They all have their uses, but for today we're going to leave it on full hand. And then all of these other settings are a bit of a preference. So the input mode, I think, is something that's not super important when you're training. You just set it to whether or not you want to, let's say, so we have king 3 of hearts and we think that it should bet half the time and check half the time. Well, in this input mode, you would put in which frequency you think it should bet. Whereas if you leave it on actions, you just pick whether it should bet or check. So those both have their uses as well. The pausing the game, I think that leaving it on off is probably the best. It'll essentially, if you were doing something like multi-tabling and you wanted to make sure that all your other tables paused and you had like a timer on, then you could make it pause after you made a mistake or after you made an action. The game speed, again, is for more of the multi-tabling aspect if you're practicing playing. And then the RNG mode is just whether or not you want to play with high RNG or low RNG. I think by default, it'll give you an RNG, but then it'll tell you the best move based on what was the highest frequency action. So if you have it set on low RNG instead, the lower the action, the more aggressive, and high RNG, the higher the action, the more aggressive. And you would try to input based on which RNG you rolled. And then, the time bank, and then the session. This is how long it'll go for. Let's say you want to study 50, 100 hands. You can click down here and choose your hands. And then the time bank is, again, if you want to practice the multi-tabling. But yeah, that's pretty much it for how I set it up. These are the settings that we'll be using today. And next we'll just go into how I actually go through the hands. So today, like I mentioned before, we'll be looking at BBB 3-bet pot on Ace Jack 7 with the flush draw. And the reason I chose this board just as an example, because it doesn't really matter which spot or which board that we pick if we're just looking at how to use the trainer effectively. But I think that this is a great example of maybe a board where people are used to playing kind of this 1/3 strategy on the flop, or like a quarter pot strategy on the flop. And some people are even just range betting here, whereas the kind of GTO strategy is a more polar strategy that involves checking back. So today we'll be looking at what happens when we check back, how do we play turns, and this will just be a good example for maybe a spot that people haven't studied before. Okay, so we've set up the trainer in the way that we want to, and we've chosen our board. I picked this one at random, arbitrarily. You can start with any board you want to. For example, I wouldn't study Ace Jack 7 and then go ahead and next choose to study Ace Jack 9, because strategically they're very similar. I would typically move on to a different board and try to, work your way through maybe a small subset of like 25 strategically different flops, So before we actually get into running the hands, what I would like to do is I would like to come in and take a look at the flop strategy of ourselves and briefly take a look at what we should be doing. That way, when we start with the trainer, we'll have a rough idea of our range. We won't be completely guessing, and we can go into turns with a bit more knowledge. So out of position is going to check with their entire range to us, because obviously they're the major disadvantage here. And then our strategy is going to be quite polar. We're going to bet with a lot of air. We're going to bet with a lot of hands that don't care if they get raised. We're going to bet with a lot of hands that don't really care about how much equity they have when called, and they more so care about either their blocking effects or their kind of lack of caring if we get raised, essentially. Because on a board like this, we don't need much protection with a lot of our hands, so there's not a lot of reason to bet with things like kings, with things like queens, things like these weaker ace-x. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. One thing you can do is you can go into filters here, and if you want to see, for example, what you do with your flush draws, you can just click spade, or you can come down here and hit flush draw. It does the same thing. Just clear the filters up here. If you want to come down and take a look at, what you do with your sets, you see that we're checking back with the higher sets, but betting the lower sets, unblocking the hands that can call. And for example, if you want to take a look at your no-mate hands. So some of these have gut shots, but if you look at the ones that very clearly don't, you come down here, you see that we're mostly betting when we have hands like total air that don't really interact with the board. And if you kind of included the king highs as well, you can see that some of these king highs are really just air. So we're prioritizing having a spade for its immediate blocking effects. We're prioritizing having the king of diamonds because it blocks more continues. The 6 of diamonds also blocks slightly more continues. And we'll choose, kind of our strategy in that way, and not choosing to bet just because we have a straight draw, like 10-9 of hearts, for example. It doesn't have great blocking effects. It can just check back. And it doesn't really perform super well in the bet, as an example. So that's the first thing I would do. Just take a brief overview. And you could go a bit further and you could take a look at, okay, how do we defend, versus the raise? What happens there? You could look at various turns. But this video isn't about how to study. It's about how to start with the trainer and run yourself through these hands. And you'll see that this can be an effective way to look at turns and rivers as well. But I do think it's important to at least have an idea of what our flop strategy looks like. Otherwise, the trainer won't be as effective. Okay, so we've taken a look at the flop strategies for this board. And in this video, we're going to be practicing the trainer for a turn spot. So we're in, obviously, BVB 3-bet pot. We're going to take a look at the check line for no other reason than that's actually the action that happens the most. It doesn't matter what turn that I'm going to put here because I'm going to make the trainer give us every possible turn. And we're going to also take a look at what happens when we're facing a check. In this spot here, you could, look at various turns. You could come into here and you could select a bunch of different turns, look at every single turn spot. What the trainer allows you to do is it feeds you those turns automatically, feeds you a hand, and then you can take a look at the solution after, which is what I'll show you. So on the left again, just clicking practice the spot. Another way to get into here, like I said before, is you can click on the trainer from anywhere and then set the spot up from here. I like to set it up from the solution because it has all the right settings automatically. And then the way again to, if we wanted to look at just when the turn was the 2 of clubs and our opponent checked, we could leave it and hit start training. But I want to look at every turn because there's a balance between being specific and being general. And I think that looking at every single turn individually is a bit too specific. Whereas looking at, for example, every single board for a BVB spot in the trainer is a bit too general. All right, so we check back the flop and we get the 9 of spades. Our opponent checks to us because that's what we have it set to do. A couple things to note which are interesting, and another cool thing about setting it up this way is that you can learn what the sizes are for various turns when your opponent does check, recognize sizing patterns. Once we do check back the flop and our opponent checks the turn, he's going to have a lot of these kind of weak, medium showdown value hands, and of course some traps, and of course some weak ace-x. But I do think that queens could absolutely bet the turn for value now, getting a lot of value from jack-x, from 9x, from even hands like 7-8, maybe something like 7-6 isn't loving life when it faces a 40%. But if we got something like 7-6 to fold, we're denying some equity. So the thing you have to weigh is it worth reopening the action here? Is it worth allowing our opponent to check raise and we have to fold queens in order to, get some value? And I think it's quite close. And just for this video, and I think it's super close, we'll go with the number here. And so I think we'll just check this back. It was close, but it was betting it a bit more than I thought. The goal of using the trainer, in my opinion, it shouldn't be to play perfect. And if you don't play perfect, it means you don't know the spot. The goal should be to make mistakes and then understand why you made that mistake and then correcting it for the future. That's one of the best ways to learn, actually, as long as you do the last step. If you just make a mistake and move on, then you didn't really learn, did you? This size is going to be for his kind of, 2-pair ace-10 that didn't bet the turn type hands. And then for bluffs, I think he does still want to be a bit diamond-based. He will have some flushes in the size, but not too many. The size isn't really built for flushes necessarily. Flushes go into that size to kind of protect us, protect him from us jamming too thin. So I'm thinking that the queen of diamonds does block occasionally a bluff, like just king queen with the queen of diamonds could potentially bluff this river. However, I think that the queen of clubs also blocking bluffs, not blocking value. I'm not sure how much a queen 10 of clubs you would put into the overbet, but I think you could. So considering we don't block really much value, the queen of diamonds only blocking those types of queen 10 of diamonds, queen jack of diamonds, queen 9 of diamonds. He doesn't have ace queen pre-flop. So yeah, all that considered, I think I'm going to fold. Also combined with a 26 here. So it's not crazy to fold. It looks like it's all very, very close. But yeah, it looks like we are supposed to call. And then you can go into the trainer. Sorry, I clicked that a bit fast. So if you see on the right here, you've got the history of the hands that you played. And you also have this little info window, which is essentially a little cheat sheet. So let's say you don't want to open the full sim, but you want to quickly just look to see what your range was doing or what your individual hand should have been doing. You can click on here. You can open it up. You can see what each player's range is like. You can click on the strategy for each player's range up here. This is kind of like a sim within the sim. Personally, I like to just open a new window by clicking on study the spot. And then you just get a brand new sim with the window that you're used to. And we can take a look and see that the overbet is indeed built around those types of 2-pair hands I was talking about. Not really built around a flush. You see that flushes don't make up most of the range, although there is a decent amount of them. And if we look at flushes, see that flushes are mixing between all of the things, 150 actually being the most common size. So I was a bit wrong on that, which is why I think I guess the Queen of Diamonds is a bit better of a blocker than I thought. Blocking Queen Jack of Diamonds, blocking Queen 10 of Diamonds, and blocking Queen 9 of Diamonds. The other thing we weren't sure about is whether or not we can bet the turn. I have the sim set up to just use one bet size on the turn, just for simplicity. And we can take a look here and see that certain combos of queens are checking back, certain combos of queens are betting. I don't think that differences, for example, checking back, Queen of Hearts, Queen of Clubs, but betting Queen of Spades, Queen of Clubs. Differences in minutia like that is not super important. That's not what you should focus on. You should focus on the general strategies. So you can focus on the pure actions. You can focus on why we're doing things, and not so much like, okay, we're betting Queen of Spades, Queen of Diamonds pure, but checking back Queen of Hearts, Queen of Diamonds a little bit. So we see that if we do have kind of this air region, like Queen 4 of Hearts to check back the flop, we start betting these pure, and not necessarily betting things like King 10, like a double gut shot pure. So again, just making sure that we're not betting equity based in position. We're betting more blocker, unblocker, defense from check raises based. Okay, let's go back to the trainer. Go into our next hand. We have queens again in a kind of similar spot, except the 9 has a lot more straight draws than the 5, obviously. Also being that it completes a straight in 10-8 suited. Notice that the size, again, is 40%. So this is what I mean by using the trainer in this way can help you identify patterns. We see that we don't really want to be reopening for a super large polar size, preferring instead to bet this kind of medium size. And that has to do with the types of hands we check back the flop with. We didn't, can I go back to here? We didn't check back the flop with much ace king or ace 10 or much 2 pairs. So on the turn, what's the strongest hand that we check back the flop with? Well, kind of ace 5, a little bit of ace queen and ace king. Are those hands strong enough? And I guess a little bit of pocket 5s and obviously the traps. But are those hands strong enough to bet for a larger size? Yes. But instead, we want to bet more of these, kings and queens for kind of value and a little bit of protection. Things like Jack 10, things like ace 4. And also, if you want to think about it like this, it's kind of a more effective size because a lot of our opponent's range has to fold no matter what size we bet, as long as it's, not 10%. Like King 9 of Hearts is going to fold whether we bet pot or whether we bet 40%. Same with pocket 2s. So it's slightly more efficient for our bluffs and allows us to value bet a bit thinner. I imagine that there will be some 2E here. It's just that GTO Wizard, the AI, believes that the 40% is the most, efficient one size. It's the highest EV one size is what it's calculating. And you see that there is a little bit of 2E. If you wanted to split, I have the sim set up just to use one size. But again, look at the hands that are strong enough to 2E. Ace king, ace 7, ace 5. These are the types of hands that I was talking about that we don't have very often. So instead, we put the strong hands into the 40 more often to protect ourselves when we do want to, bet thin and bet these hands as a bluff. So kind of we just cheated. We looked at the spot, but I'm just going to check it back here on the 13. I think we have a clear raise here on the river once we do check back. It's funny, I was just talking about how, we want to bet thin here in certain hands and which combos, and then I just totally checked it back. So yeah, we're going to go for a raise here. I think that we don't want to go too large because he will have a bunch of ace-x still. And it's a bit too thin if we go too large, but mostly the size is for a jack or potentially even worse. So I think we're going to raise one of these medium sizes. I think I picked the wrong size here, which is why it was a mistake. I don't think raising is a mistake. It looks like raising was not a mistake. I did pick the wrong size, but it was mostly calling. So yeah, that's interesting. And whenever you find something interesting, you can click on study the spot, go to the solution, and, take a look at both sides. So we see that 40% is the most common size used here. some sort of, small, medium size, allowing him to bet a jack. But then he also puts like all of his ace-x into that size as well. So if his range is, jack x and ace-x for value, when we raise, we got to get called by something still. So raising, and you see that he mainly folds. I shouldn't say mainly folds. He sometimes folds a jack, and then all he's left with is this ace-x. So whenever you're in position, your threshold for raising and your threshold for betting always, always, always go down, as in like you can't do it as thin as if you were out of position. You'll notice here, out of position can bet a jack, but in position, facing a check, doesn't necessarily even want to reopen all of his jack X, because we give him the option to check raise. So we give him an additional strategic option. Therefore, we have to be more careful when we're in position on the river. In position in general, I guess. Okay, so back to the trainer. So we check back the flop, get the 2-turn. And it's interesting here that we prefer a slightly bigger bet than 40 when the turn is the deuce rather than the 5 of double flush draw. So just something to keep in mind. This hand can definitely check back the turn again. 3 of diamonds isn't super relevant because he doesn't have many flush draws that have a 3 of diamonds. In fact, I don't think he has any. So the only thing you're blocking is pocket 3s. That's the only thing you're interacting with. We could bet, obviously, getting called by worse, but I think we'll just check this one back on a 51. Looks like I had the wrong frequency there. And now if we played our range correctly, we have checked back enough air on the river to have bluffs here. We can be perceived to not have very many bluffs here, but we're playing against the solver, so that doesn't really matter. And we're going to go for the bets. I think it is a little bit thin, but going for the bet seems fine to me. Yeah, can check it back already. So I would take a look at the turn spot there, because I thought that on the turn we would check it back a bit more often than we would bet it, having the just ace-3 as a hand class. So ace-5, ace-4, checking back more than ace-3. When you have the diamond, I guess it blocks one flush draw out, so it's like slightly better. I'm not exactly sure, because it looks like the EV is very similar with ace-3. Small differences in combo choice, not very important. Your general strategy and what you're doing in Y is much more important. So yeah, we're of course getting called by worse, and then we're just going to check back every river, I believe. I mean, this river is a bit more obvious that we're going to check back, but yeah. Okay, not much to say there. If it does go check, and then the river was something like the 10 of diamonds, this is important. So if you didn't play your range correctly, and you kind of just bet all your air on the flop, and then any air that you didn't bet on the flop, you just bet it all on the turn, you're kind of lacking bluffs here. And you can see that even the solver is lacking bluffs. So we look at King 9. This might be close to some of these queen highs and king highs. These are close to like the only air that even the solver has. So if you're not checking back even these hands, or things like 5-4 or 5-3 or 6-5, actually no, that's just diamonds, you'll see that most people will be severely under bluffing here. So just something to keep in mind across different runouts, how easy it is to have bluffs compared to how hard it is to have bluffs. Not something you have to worry about when you're playing against the solver and the trainer here, but against your real opponents, that's going to be very important. You see that we're even turning some 7-6 of spades into a bluff here. So imagine someone who never checked back these on the flop or turn. What are they going to be bluffing with? Probably not much, right? So we saw we were opening relatively polar on the 2, which means I don't think we'll ever reopen these pocket 9s. No reason to. And then the river again is going to be a bit too thin. So we saw before, again, we had a similar spot where the flush came on the river and he overbet in the check down line. And we had pocket queens, I believe, on a slightly different board. And we saw that there are some flushes going into this size. And having the 9 of diamonds is relevant here because we don't block any bluffs And this is where knowing your preflop ranges is really important, and kind of just, you got to memorize the preflop ranges, let's be honest, and also knowing the flop strategy. Because if you think about the preflop ranges, what bluff could he have that has the 9 of diamonds? None. There's no bluffs that he could have that have the 9 of diamonds, because he doesn't have any offsuit combos that have the 9 of diamonds. He doesn't call king 9 off pre or 9-8 off. He could have pocket 9s, but he wouldn't bluff it here. He doesn't need to. He has showdown value. So then now we have the 9 of hearts. So what bluffs could he have with the 9 of hearts? Well, now he can have some bluffs. He can have some 9-8 that didn't bet the turn, some 10-9 that didn't bet the turn, although I expect those would mostly bet the turn. So overall, I think our hand makes a fine call, and I think our hand makes an okay all-in as well. Just the 9 of diamonds being a really good card here, blocking a lot of his flushes, but then also not blocking any of his bluffs. So I think we're just going to call. It's a mistake. And all-in was a huge mistake. All right. So this is what I mean by when you're making mistakes like this, mistakes in your thinking, to go into the actual solution and find out why you thought that, and then correct that thinking. So the trainer helps you find these mistakes rather than making them in game. Because you could make this in game, and maybe you look at the hand later and you identify your mistake, or maybe you don't and you just made a mistake and you don't learn from it. So let's go into the solution here. First thing I check is the overbet from out of position, and I can immediately see where my mistake is. We see that unlike the other run out we had where we had pocket queens, here the overbet is mainly just for an ace and not many flushes. You see that he has much less of a flush going into here, and the ones that have the 9 of diamonds are actually mostly checking. It's a bit of a nuanced thing. It's not something crazy. It's not like a huge learning experience that's going to help you in a bunch of other spots. But I guess the takeaway here would be, think more about the types of hands that your opponent would be value betting on the specific run out, and less so about, oh, I block a flush. So here, if we look at which hands actually go all in as a bluff, we can see that, again, easy way to do this is you can go down to filters, and then you can take a look at, I guess, well, no draw doesn't matter, but you can see that we are using some second pairs, some third pairs, kings and queens with the diamond blockers. So yeah, just chose the wrong pair to go all in with here. The queen of diamonds and the king of diamonds, they're not only strictly better because they block flushes, they also, here, they don't block something like queen 9 of spades. So that's why specifically, and also ace 9. So kings doesn't block our opponent from folding ace 9, or 10-9, or queen 9. So we didn't identify the bluffs and value bets that were bet folding. We thought only about the flushes. That was the mistake. All right, so this hand could bet. It does get some of these like lower pairs that the small blind calls to fold. We don't want to always value bet it, or sorry, not value bet it. We don't want to always bet it. So we'll check it back here on the 13. And again, we get this kind of overbet. Here, I don't think that this size is the most used size. I think this is a more rare size, and it's built around having ace. And considering that our opponent does not ever have ace king or ace queen, we do not really have blocking effects to the value bet, to his value region, I mean. Whereas we do block some bluffs, so I think this combo will just always fold. And we can check if we were right. And we see that I was right, that the overbet is a bit more rare than the other two sizes combined, although it's used kind of equally with all the other sizes. We see that's for like these kind of weak ace-X, the stronger ace-X going for the trap instead. And then facing the overbet, if we look at the blocking effects of king queen, you see that it's all negative blockers. You're blocking bluffs, like you're tying with some bluffs even. So you're calling and not even winning all the time. And then you're blocking some bluffs like queen 10, king 8, and then you're not blocking any value. So instead, we would hero call something like tens, which actually at least, blocks occasionally. He doesn't have too much ace 10, but a little bit. And then also it doesn't interact with as many bluffs. That's not like super obvious, but we'd rather call a jack as well, rather call a 7-6, which again doesn't interact with the bluffs and actually has, kings. I don't know why kings is calling there. Okay, so let's do a couple more hands here. So we get the 8 of diamonds, and we see that our preferred bet size is to B25 on the turn, which is definitely interesting. One thing you can do with these spots, which is maybe something to do before you start working with the trainer, something you could do after, is you can go into the pre-solved, the classic 6-max post-flop included. These will have reports for turns and flops, whereas if you're doing it with AI, there's not going to be any turn reports available. You have to go to the solution library. So what you can do is you can go into this solution. This is 310 call, which is, slightly different, but not a big deal. And then you can go to the spot and look at the various turns here. So you can see the diamonds, you can see the low cards, you can see what the sizing choice looks like across various turns. Another thing you could do is you could simply open up the solution if you don't want to go into the reports, and you can just pick various, turns. It's pretty quick. You can just see that, okay, on the 3 of diamonds, it's B25ing. On the king of diamonds, it's B67ing. So you can kind of classify turns like that. And the trainer is a good way to get you to remember, essentially. It's not necessarily more efficient than going in and looking at these turn reports and doing the work on a more macro level. But what it is better at is making you remember, in my opinion. Okay, so should we be betting here? My instinct says yes. I think that, we have the 9 blocker to the straight as well as the straight draw. We do get some better hands to fold, and our hand has very, very little showdown value. The thing to consider is, should we check back and then bluff the river? I think that's valid, but personally, I think we should bet here. It's going to be close either way. This is one downside, of course, to betting, is now we have to bet fold, but it's okay because it's not like we had to bet fold something that actually had, a lot of value. Okay, we can go to the next hand. I think that pocket tens, while, it does have these blocking effects to the straight, and it does have essentially, the best possible blockers to a lot of our opponents, straights, flush draws, and even straight draws. I think we have enough showdown value to just check it back. We don't have to turn it into a bluff or anything like that. Although it is merge betting the turn some of the time, so that's interesting. Easy check back if he checks, and then if he bets. The way I like to think about these spots is thinking about each one of your blockers individually. When we're thinking about it in a theory way, if you're just playing a person, lots of better ways to think about it. Like, is he bluffing too much? Is he value betting too little? But when we're thinking theory, the 10 of diamonds just blocks value. Because the way the preflop ranges work, he doesn't call any 10x offsuit combos, really. The only one that can mix in there is like ace 10 off, and usually that is 4-bet or fold. So no bluffs with the 10 of diamonds. And then the 10 of clubs, it blocks jack 10 suited and ace 10 suited. And then it also blocks queen 10 suited and king 10 suited. And then obviously it blocks, 10-8 of clubs. All in all, I would say that's more like a neutral card. And then the 10 of diamonds is, I would say, strictly good because it blocks flushes. So I don't think that this hand ever wants to fold. So it's just a question of, do we want to use it as a raise? So what are going to be his bet folds on the river, and what are going to be his bet calls? That's a better way to think about it than rather, I block a flush. So obviously he's got bet folds in the ace region. So something like ace 10. He's got bet folds, I guess, in the jack region are going to be indifferent if we raise, depending on what size we raise to. And then he's got some bet calls with the 10 of diamonds, but I think he has more bet folds that we block than he does bet calls or bet re-raises. So therefore, I think this hand just wants to call. And it is a pure call. So in a way, I got lucky, but because, I'm not going to as you saw as the other ones before, you can't know every single spot. It's not practical. But this exact spot, we identified that it's supposed to just call and not raise for the reasons I said, hopefully. Let's take a look and see. Okay, so 10 of spades, 10 of diamonds actually is going for it, and that has to do with the fact that those hands that I mentioned, like queen 10 of clubs and king 10 of clubs, he's not going to have king 10 of spades and queen 10 of spades as much because those are going to bet the turn. So that's why the 10 of spades is a bit of a better raise than the other ones. Interesting that it's a worse call, though. That's not super obvious. I guess it has to do with how many ace 10 that he blocks. You never really want to dive too deeply into these like little tiny combo choices. Much more important to understand your overall strategies. I know I keep repeating myself, but I do think that that's important. All right, so my instinct says to just check this back. I don't think he's folding any better Jack X if we bet the turn. He's obviously not folding an ace. He's calling with some worse hands, but for the most part, I don't see a huge reason to bet. Although last hand, I didn't see us betting the turn with pocket tens, and we were betting the turn sometimes, so can always be surprised. So, obviously the instinct is to call. He's not bluffing a 9, and he's not bluffing a jack. The value bets, we don't really block too many value bets. I guess he could bet pocket 9s, and obviously 10-9 of spades, and then jack 10 of hearts. But those are the only value bets we block. Whenever your opponent is betting not super large, like the smaller that they bet, the more important it is to unblock their bluffs. And the larger that they bet, the more important it is to block their value. So in this case, when they're betting kind of medium, it's not super relevant. My instinct says that this will just be a call. We do end up losing the 10-9, but if we come down here and take a look, I imagine this will not be a very high EV call. This will be a relatively low EV call. And it's, again, not because we beat value. It's not because we necessarily block value. It's because we have good blocking effects. You see that the positive blocking effects is all the way up to 9 for some combos of Jack 9. And the negative effects are only 1 because he's not bluffing a 9. He's not bluffing a jack. So that's why we're calling with this hand here, even though we don't really beat value. Let's just make sure that he's not betting 2 pairs here. There's actually a little tiny bit of Jack 9 betting for 66, which is why we're even slightly higher in EV. And actually, there's a little tiny bit. No, that's just diamonds. Okay, so we do tie some value as well. All right, let's do one more hand. So we literally just had Jack 9 on this. We were checking back pure. Is there more reason to bet Queen Jack on the turn? Well, obviously now we beat Jack 10 and we beat Jack 9. That's a big difference. We also don't block 10s and 9s, which can call us. We can bet and then check back on the river. The downside to betting is we allow our opponent to check raise, and we don't get to collect versus bluffs on the river from his like total air that would fold. So that's always the trade-off here. I think we'll go for the bets. No, it is a mistake. Okay. Was very, very indecisive there on whether we should be betting or checking. I don't think we should bluff this combo on the river. I don't think that because of the way preflop ranges work, we have enough air that we don't need to like pull from having it. Oh, geez. Huge mistakes. So let's take a look at this. Yeah, and we see that only a little tiny bit of King Jack is getting into the bet. It is quite close between betting and checking on the turn, but it looks like we're just not strong enough. And even though we do get called by some Jack 10 and Jack 9, we also get raised by these hands. Same with 9s that I mentioned. 10s he doesn't really have with this rake structure, I guess, because I think that he just jams it pre at 200 an L rake, which fair enough. So yeah, it's just a bit too thin. We're not getting called enough by worse. We're getting called, as you see, mostly by an ace. And then we're getting hands that we kind of dominate to fold, like king, queen. And it would operate already as kind of a merge bet on the turn. We're getting king, jack to fold, but we're getting called by these like pairs. So in practice, if your opponent isn't very aggressive, I think you could go for the bet, but this was just a mistake here. And then when we do bet, I thought that on the river here, we would have enough air. Things like king 5, yeah, things like this, 10-5, 10-3, king 5, king 7. But I guess the point is that a lot of the hands that bet the turn that used to be air, like king 9 and queen 9, now river to straight. So if a lot of your bluffs now river to straight, you're going to have to find other bluffs. And yeah, bluffing a 10 made a bit more sense to me than bluffing a jack. But yeah, it looks like we would bluff all of our one pair hands here that aren't an ace. And it makes sense looking at the solution now, but thinking about it in the trainer, it did not make sense. So yeah, just another example of kind of identifying mistakes in your thought patterns. Okay, so we've gone through some hands. We've looked at how I set up the trainer or possible ways that you could set up the trainer. And I really do think that the trainer is a great tool mixed in with actual studying where you dive deep into sims and you look at different hand classes and everything like that. This is a good way to kind of practice before you get on the tables. You can set it up in so many different ways. And I do like to use the trainer to help me study in basically every spot that I look at. And for some key takeaways for using the trainer, I think it's important when you're studying or using the trainer, like I said before, don't be too specific. Don't dive into, what should we do in the 3-bet pod versus raise and then 3-bet on the flop on various, on exactly the 2 of clubs. But then on the flip side, you don't also want to be looking at every single possible board or set yourself up for a trainer to, open the button and then play against every single possible situation. While that might be the most fun and the most interesting to do, I think you get the least out of it in terms of actually recognizing patterns. So there is a balance between being too specific and being too general. The next thing for the trainer is it's good to make mistakes. That's why you're using the trainer. And making the mistakes and then receiving immediate feedback is, in my opinion, one of the best ways to learn. Your brain remembers when you make a mistake. Your brain remembers, if you acknowledge why you made the mistake, at least for me, my brain remembers for next time. So you can make the mistakes in the trainer instead of on the tables. And yes, as long as you are, correcting the thought patterns that led to that mistake. And then the key takeaways for the actual spot that we looked at, just some things that I noticed right off the bat is don't structure your bets when you're in position. Whenever you're playing kind of these polarized strategies, don't structure your bets based on equity when you have bluffs. You can structure your bets based on blocking effects, based on do you care if you get check raised, based on do you interact with your opponent's range, which is just kind of another way. Do you interact with your opponent's folding range, which is kind of another way to say your blocking effects or unblocking effects. But having equity is not as important necessarily because we're so polar, because we have so much air and so much, I guess you could call it nuts, although another way to say it would just be strong hands. This is when you're betting the flop for this kind of larger size rather than just betting it for a third range, of course. The second thing I would say for this exact spot is you have to be a little bit careful when we look in the check down lines, when we saw on the river that it's quite hard to be bluffing on some rivers if you never check back air. So you have to check back some air on the flop, and then you have to check back some air on the turn. It's not very much on most. As you saw, we were mainly betting it, but if you never ever check back air to the river, it'll be very, very hard to be bluffing enough once he does check to you on the river again. And then the last thing is be careful when you're reopening for value in position, especially on the river. So you need to get called by worse enough to justify value betting in the first place. And then you also always give your opponent the ability to check raise you. They're going to be check raising you with, if they're balanced, enough bluffs and enough value. And then that greatly diminishes the value of these kind of thin value bets. Whereas if you were out of position, you don't give him the option to re-raise you. So you can bet a lot thinner when you're out of position compared to when you're in position. And that's not unique to this spot, but I think it is important considering that we are in position and thinking about betting thin a lot of the time on the river. And yeah, that's it. If you like this content, give it a like. And if you want to see or hear more of me, you can check my channel. Should be in the description. And subscribe here if you want more videos like this. Take care.